The blood-streaked sunset painted the Wyoming Territory sky as Madeline Zimmerman clutched the crumpled telegram in her trembling hands, the words blurring through her tears. Fort Laramie had fallen silent for her that spring day in 1876, despite the usual bustle of military life carrying on around her small quarters at the edge of the garrison. She'd read the message a dozen times since the courier delivered it, but the words remained unchanged, brutal in their finality. Regret to inform, Lieutenant Thomas Blackwell, killed in action, Apache Territory. The neat military language couldn't disguise the horror of it. Thomas, her fiancé of 2 years, the man she'd followed out west against her parents' wishes, was gone, 3 weeks before their wedding. 3 weeks before the life they'd planned would begin. Madeline had come to Fort Laramie from Philadelphia a year earlier, after Thomas had established himself as a promising young officer. Her parents had begged her to wait, to let him complete his tour and return east, but she couldn't bear the separation. Now she was alone, 1,000 miles from home, with nothing but a small trunk of possessions and a future that had vanished like smoke. A knock at her door startled her from her grief. Miss Zimmerman, the fort commander's wife, Mrs. Fletcher, stood outside with reddened eyes. The mail coach to Rawlins leaves in the morning. The commander thought, perhaps you'd want to return east now. Madeline smoothed the telegram with numb fingers. Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll be ready. But as the older woman left, Madeline realized she couldn't face Philadelphia, couldn't bear to see the pity in the eyes of friends and family who had warned her against this western adventure. Thomas was buried somewhere in the desert, and she couldn't abandon the land that held him. I'll go to Rawlins, she whispered to herself. Just until I decide what to do next. The journey to Rawlins, Wyoming, took 2 long, dusty days. Madeline barely noticed the changing landscape, the rolling plains giving way to rugged hills. Her fellow passengers, a missionary couple and a cattle buyer, tried engaging her in conversation, but she couldn't summon the energy to respond beyond polite murmurs. Rawlins wasn't much to look at when the coach finally arrived. Just a scattered collection of wooden buildings clustered around the railroad depot, with the promise of becoming something more substantial. The settlement had sprung up with the Union Pacific Railroad just 7 years earlier and maintained its existence through the railway, nearby mining operations, and the cattle drives that passed through. The driver helped her down from the coach, setting her trunk on the dusty street. "Hotel's just down the way, madam," he said, pointing toward a 2-story clapboard building with a sagging porch. "Best accommodations in town, though that ain't saying much." Madeline nodded, reaching for her purse to tip him when a commotion erupted down the street. A group of cowboys had emerged from a saloon, shouting and laughing as they mounted their horses. One of them, a tall man with a weathered face beneath his wide-brimmed hat, broke away from the group and rode toward the stage. "Jenkins," he called to the driver. "Any mail come in from Cheyenne?" "Check the depot, Reed," the driver replied. "Just got in myself." The cowboy nodded, then noticed Madeline standing beside her trunk. He tipped his hat politely. "Madam." She managed a slight nod in return, then turned back to the driver. "Could someone help me with my trunk?" "I'll send one of the hotel boys," the driver replied, already turning away. "I can help you, madam," the cowboy offered, dismounting in one fluid motion. He tied his horse to a nearby post and approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Reed Kincaid of the Circle K Ranch." "I'd be happy to carry that to the hotel for you." Madeline hesitated. In Philadelphia, she never would have accepted help from a strange man. But this was Wyoming Territory, and she was alone, exhausted, and facing the prospect of dragging her trunk down the street herself. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid, I'd appreciate that." He hoisted her trunk with ease, balancing it on one broad shoulder. "New to Rawlins?" he asked as they walked. "Yes, I arrived from Fort Laramie." He glanced at her black dress, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." The simple words, spoken without pity or intrusion, almost broke her composure. She blinked rapidly, focusing on the dusty street ahead. "Thank you." They walked in silence to the hotel, where he set her trunk down gently in the small lobby. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles, looked up from his ledger. "Room for the lady, Simmons," Reed said. "Just in from Fort Laramie." Of course, Simmons slid the register toward Madeline. That'll be 50 cents a night or $3 for the week, Miss Zimmerman. Madeline Zimmerman. She signed the book and counted out $3 from her purse. I'll take it for the week. Reed Kincaid lingered, hat in hand. Do you have family in town, Miss Zimmerman? No, no one. Something flickered in his eyes, concern, perhaps. Well, if you need anything, the Circle K is just 8 miles north. Anyone in town can point you in the right direction. She nodded politely, though she had no intention of seeking out a strange ranch. Thank you for your help, Mr. Kincaid. He seemed about to say something more, then thought better of it. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, boots echoing on the wooden porch. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Madeline unpacked her few belongings mechanically, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe. When she reached the bottom of her trunk, her fingers brushed against Thomas's letters, neatly bundled with blue ribbon. She pushed them aside, unable to bear reading them again. That night, she lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town laughter from the saloon down the street, the occasional horse passing by, the distant whistle of a train. She had $17.42 to her name, enough to live frugally for perhaps 2 months. By then, she would need to make a decision: return east in defeat or find a way to support herself here. The next morning, Madeline dressed carefully in her second-best black dress and ventured out to explore the town. Rawlins consisted of little more than one main street with a few side alleys. The railway depot was the largest building, followed by the hotel and 3 competing saloons. There was a general store, a small church, a doctor's office, and a handful of other businesses catering to the needs of railroad workers, cowboys, and miners. She stepped into the general store, where a middle-aged woman was arranging bolts of fabric on a shelf. "Good morning," the woman said, turning at the bell above the door. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm just looking, thank you," Madeline replied. "I arrived yesterday and wanted to acquaint myself with the town." The woman's eyes softened as she took in Madeline's morning clothes. "I'm Sarah Miller. My husband and I own this store. You're staying at the hotel?" "Yes, I'm Madeline Zimmerman." "Well, Miss Zimmerman, welcome to Rawlins." "Not much to look at compared to back east, I expect, but we get by." She paused, studying Madeline's face. "If you don't mind my asking, are you passing through or staying on?" "I'm not entirely certain yet." Mrs. Miller nodded as if this explained everything. "Well, if you're looking to stay, you should talk to Mrs. Camden over at the schoolhouse. She's getting on in years and mentioned she's looking for someone to help with the younger children." Madeline's interest piqued. She had always enjoyed children, and though she had no formal teaching experience, she was well educated. "Where might I find the schoolhouse?" "Just past the church, small white building. Can't miss it." Mrs. Miller leaned in conspiratorially. "Pay isn't much, mind you, but it's respectable work for a lady alone." The implication was clear: there weren't many respectable options for a woman in a frontier town. Madeline thanked her and continued her exploration, making her way toward the schoolhouse. The building was indeed small, with a single room and perhaps 20 desks arranged in neat rows. An elderly woman stood at the blackboard, instructing a group of children ranging from about 6 to 14 years of age. Madeline waited outside until the noon recess, when the children poured out into the yard. Mrs. Camden, a tiny woman with a spine as straight as a ramrod despite her apparent 70 years, spotted Madeline immediately. "Are you here about the teaching position?" she asked without preamble. Madeline blinked in surprise. Yes, Mrs. Miller at the general store mentioned you might be looking for assistance." "I am. These old eyes can't see well enough to grade papers anymore, and the little ones need more attention than I can give while teaching the older students." She gestured for Madeline to follow her inside. "You have experience with children?" "I helped care for my younger siblings, and I taught Sunday school in Philadelphia," Madeline replied. It wasn't much, but it was the truth. Mrs. Camden studied her shrewdly. "You're educated, though." "I can tell by your speech. Can you read Latin?" "Yes, and French as well." The old teacher's eyebrows rose slightly. "Unusual education for a woman. What brings you to Rawlins, Miss?" "Zimmerman, Madeline Zimmerman." She hesitated, then decided on honesty. My fiancé was an officer at Fort Laramie. He was killed 3 weeks ago in Apache Territory. Mrs. Camden's face softened. I'm sorry, my dear. This country takes so many young men. She was quiet for a moment, then said, the position pays $15 a month. You'd work with the younger children in the mornings while I teach the older ones, then help grade papers and prepare lessons in the afternoons. It wasn't much, but it would cover her room at the hotel and basic necessities. I'd like to accept, Mrs. Camden. Good, you can start tomorrow. The old woman smiled for the first time. And please call me Beatrice. That evening, Madeline wrote to her parents, informing them of Thomas's death and her decision to remain in Wyoming for the time being. She didn't mention her new position. They would only worry about her working for wages. As she sealed the envelope, she realized that for the first time since receiving the telegram, she had gone several hours without crying. It wasn't healing, not yet. But perhaps it was a beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adaptation. Teaching proved more challenging than Madeline had anticipated. The children of Rawlins were a mix of rough and tumble offspring of railroad workers, Cowboy's children sent to town for schooling, and a few from more genteel families connected to the railway's management. Many had received spotty education at best, and Madeline found herself improvising lessons to accommodate their varied levels. Beatrice Camden proved to be an excellent mentor, firm but kind with the children and patient with Madeline's inexperience. By the end of her first month, Madeline had settled into a routine. She rose early, took breakfast at the hotel, taught until mid-afternoon, then either helped Beatrice with school preparations or explored the surrounding area. She wrote to her parents weekly, her letters carefully edited to portray her life in Rawlins in the most positive light. She didn't tell them about the loneliness that engulfed her in the evenings, or how she still cried herself to sleep clutching Thomas's letters. They wouldn't understand why she remained in this harsh land, and truthfully, she wasn't entirely sure herself. It was on a Saturday in early June when she encountered Reed Kincaid again. Madeline had ventured to the small creek just outside town, seeking solitude and a respite from the dusty streets. She sat on a flat rock, shoes and stockings removed, feet dangling in the cool water as she read a book of poetry that Thomas had given her. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her hurriedly withdraw her feet and straighten her skirts. Reed appeared around a bend in the creek, leading his horse to water. He stopped short when he saw her. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, tipping his hat, "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't, Mr. Kincaid," she replied, though she quickly tucked her bare feet beneath her skirts. "I was just enjoying the quiet," he nodded, keeping a respectful distance while his horse drank. "I heard you've been teaching at the schoolhouse. The children speak highly of you." She smiled slightly. They're good children if a bit wild at times. Wyoming tends to have that effect. He hesitated, then asked, "How are you finding Rawlins?" "It's different from what I'm accustomed to," she admitted, "but the people have been kind." Reed seemed to debate with himself before speaking again. "Mrs. Camden mentioned you lost your fiancé recently. I'm sorry, was he with the cavalry?" "Yes, Lieutenant Thomas Blackwell, 2nd Cavalry." The name still caught in her throat. "He was escorting a supply train when they were attacked." Reed's face grew solemn. "I served with the 2nd briefly during the war, though I was just a boy. They're good men. You were in the war, you don't seem old enough." A fleeting smile crossed his weathered face. "I was 16 when I enlisted in '64, lied about my age. Spent a year fighting before it ended." Madeline studied him with new interest. She'd placed him in his early 30s, but if he'd been 16 in 1864, that would make him only 28 now. The harsh western sun and wind had aged him beyond his years. "What brought you to Wyoming afterward?" she asked. "Same as most men, land and opportunity." He gazed across the creek. "My father lost our farm in Missouri during the war, came out here in '68, started with nothing but 20 head of cattle and a dream. Now Circle K runs 800 head on 18,000 acres. There was quiet pride in his voice, not boastfulness. Madeline found herself curious about this man who had built something from nothing in this unforgiving land. "And your family?" she asked. "Are they here as well?" A shadow crossed his face. "My father died 3 years ago, pneumonia. Mother passed during the war, no siblings that survived childhood. I'm sorry, she said genuinely. It must be lonely. Got about a dozen hands working the ranch, good men mostly, and plenty of work to keep me occupied. He straightened, as if uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. Speaking of which, I should be getting back. Madeline nodded, suddenly aware of how improper it was to be sitting alone with a man she barely knew, her bare feet in the creek. Of course. Thank you for stopping to talk, Mr. Kincaid. He mounted his horse, then paused. Miss Zimmerman, the town's holding a social next Saturday evening, dance at the schoolhouse to raise money for books. As the teacher, you ought to attend. It wasn't quite an invitation, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he hoped to see her there. Madeline hadn't considered attending dancing while in mourning would raise eyebrows back east, but this wasn't Philadelphia. Perhaps I will, she said. Good day, Mr. Kincaid. Reed, he corrected with a slight smile. Out here, we don't stand much on formality. After he rode away, Madeline remained by the creek, considering their conversation. It was the longest exchange she'd had with anyone outside the school since arriving in Rawlins. For a brief moment, she'd forgotten her grief, engaged in the simple pleasure of conversation with an interesting person. The realization brought a wave of guilt. How could she forget, even momentarily, when Thomas lay cold in the ground? She gathered her belongings and headed back to town, the peaceful mood of the morning shattered. That night, she dreamed of Thomas. Not the bloodied, dying Thomas her mind often conjured, but the laughing, vital man she'd fallen in love with. In the dream, he stood in a sunlit meadow, smiling at her. You need to live, Maddie, he said, using the nickname only he had ever called her. I'm gone, but you're still here. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but they felt different somehow, cleansing rather than drowning. The week passed quickly. Beatrice had her help decorate the schoolhouse for the social, hanging paper lanterns and pushing the desks against the walls to create space for dancing. The children were excitable, the older girls gossiping about which boys might ask them to dance, the younger ones looking forward to the promised cake and lemonade. You should wear your blue dress, Beatrice told her on Friday afternoon as they hung the last of the decorations. The one without the black trim. Madeline looked at her in surprise. I'm in mourning. The old teacher's eyes were kind but direct. For a fiancé, half-mourning is acceptable after 3 months. It's been nearly that. In Philadelphia, this isn't Philadelphia, dear. Out here, life is too short and hard to spend it draped in black. She patted Madeline's hand. Just consider it. Saturday evening arrived clear and warm. Madeline stood before the small mirror in her hotel room, studying her reflection. After much deliberation, she decided on a compromise: her dark blue dress with a black shawl and a small black ribbon at her throat. Her chestnut hair was simply styled, pulled back from her face with tortoiseshell combs that had been a gift from Thomas. The schoolhouse was transformed when she arrived. Lanterns cast a warm glow, wildflowers adorned every surface, and a trio of musicians, a fiddler, a banjo player, and an accordion player, were tuning their instruments in the corner. Most of the town seemed to be in attendance, from the children she taught to the grizzled old-timers who usually haunted the saloons. Beatrice immediately pulled her into service at the refreshment table, pouring lemonade and serving slices of cake baked by the town's women. The work kept Madeline occupied and helped ease her discomfort as the music started and couples began to dance. She was arranging a new plate of cookies when a familiar voice spoke beside her. Evening, Miss Zimmerman. Reed Kincaid stood there, looking almost unrecognizable in clean black trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a string tie. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. Only the tan lines from his hat and the calloused hands gave away his profession. Good evening, Mr. Kincaid, she replied, suddenly self-conscious. I'm glad you could attend, wouldn't miss it. Town socials don't happen often enough out here. He glanced at the dance floor where couples were circling to a lively reel. Would you care to dance? Madeline hesitated. The last man she had danced with was Thomas, at a military ball at Fort Laramie. The thought of dancing with someone else felt like a betrayal, and yet. I should help Mrs. Camden with the refreshments, she said, though Beatrice was managing perfectly well without her. Reed nodded, accepting her refusal gracefully. Of course, perhaps later. He drifted away, soon partnering with Sarah Miller's teenage daughter for a dance. Madeline watched, noting how he moved with surprising grace for such a tall man, how he smiled and laughed with his young partner without a hint of impropriety. "He's a good man," Beatrice said, appearing beside her. "One of the few in these parts who treats women with genuine respect, not just the appearance of it." "I'm sure he is," Madeline replied noncommittally. "He lost someone too, you know, before he came west." Beatrice arranged cups on the table. "His sweetheart died of typhoid during the war while he was away fighting. Never talked about it much, but Mrs. Miller heard it from an old army friend of his who passed through a few years back." Madeline's eyes followed Reed across the room. "I didn't know." "Some wounds heal better in the open air. That's what my late husband used to say." Beatrice smiled gently. "Go dance, Madeline. Thomas wouldn't want you standing in the corner all night." As if sensing their conversation, Reed looked up and caught Madeline's eye across the room. Something in his gaze, a quiet understanding, perhaps made her decision for her. When the current dance ended and he approached the refreshment table again, she spoke before he could. "I believe I would like to dance now, Mr. Kincaid, if your offer still stands." His smile was warm. "It does." The musicians struck up a waltz and Reed led her onto the floor. His hand was warm and steady at her waist, his movements confident without being overbearing. They danced in silence for a few moments, finding their rhythm together. "You dance well," she said finally. "My mother insisted I learn. Said no woman would marry a man who stepped on her toes." A shadow of sadness crossed his face. She never got to see if she was right. "I'm sure she would be proud of the man you've become." He looked at her with surprise, then genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Zimmerman." "Madeline," she corrected, surprising herself. "If we're not standing on formality." "Madeline," he repeated, as if testing the feel of it on his tongue. They danced until the music ended, then stepped apart, both suddenly aware of the curious glances from the townspeople. Madeline felt her cheeks flush. "Would you like some air?" Reed asked, noticing her discomfort. She nodded, and he led her to the schoolhouse door and out onto the porch. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Wyoming sky. After the heat and noise inside, the quiet was a balm. "I never saw stars like this in Philadelphia," Madeline said, gazing upward. "The city lights hide them. That's one thing we've got plenty of out here, stars and space." Reed leaned against the porch railing. "Do you miss it, the city?" She considered the question carefully. "I miss certain things, libraries, museums, the comfort of knowing exactly what's expected in any situation." She smiled wryly. "Sidewalks without mud," he laughed. "Can't argue with that last one." "But there's something freeing about being here," she continued, surprising herself with her honesty. "In Philadelphia, everyone would know exactly how long I should mourn, what I should wear, when I should be ready to consider another match. Here I can just be." Reed was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you stayed? Freedom from expectations?" "Partly," she admitted. "And partly because I couldn't bear to leave him behind. Thomas, I mean. He loved this country so much. Going east felt like abandoning him somehow." Reed nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The first year is the hardest. After that, it gets, not easier exactly, but different. The pain becomes part of you, something you carry rather than something that crushes you." His words, spoken from experience, touched something in Madeline. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly understood. "How did you do it?" she asked quietly. "How did you move forward?" He gazed out at the starlit landscape. "Work helped, building something lasting, and time." He turned to her, his expression serious. "And eventually, I realized that living a full life was the best way to honor her memory." Inside, the music had started again, a lively folk tune that spilled out into the night. Reed straightened, offering his hand. "One more dance before I take you home." Madeline looked at his outstretched hand, then placed hers in it. "Yes, I'd like that." The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to Madeline's life in Rawlins. She began taking her Sunday meals at the boarding house where Beatrice lived, joining the older woman and the other boarders, 2 railway clerks, and a young widow who worked at the telegraph office for long, leisurely dinners. The conversation and company eased the loneliness of her evenings. She wrote to her parents, finally telling them about her teaching position. Their reply was predictably concerned, urging her to return east where they could find her a more suitable situation. But she detected a note of pride beneath their worry. Reed Kincaid became a more frequent visitor to town. He would appear on Saturdays, ostensibly for supplies, but he invariably found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or encounter Madeline on her walks. Their conversations grew longer, ranging from books they had read to their differing experiences of the war years. He began bringing her small gifts, a particularly interesting rock from the ranch, wildflowers that grew in a meadow near the Circle K, once a wooden hairpin he had carved himself during the long winter evenings. Madeline found herself looking forward to these visits, planning her Saturday errands to coincide with the times Reed usually came to town. It wasn't courting. Not exactly, both were too aware of her recent loss for that, but it was a friendship tinged with something that might, someday, become more. One hot July afternoon, Reed arrived in town earlier than usual. Madeline was just dismissing her students when he appeared at the schoolhouse door, hat in hand. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, nodding politely to the children as they filed past him. "Mrs. Camden." Beatrice, who had been openly supportive of Reed's attentions, beamed at him. "Mr. Kincaid, what brings you to town so early? Thought I'd see if Miss Zimmerman might be interested in a picnic supper by the creek," he replied, his eyes on Madeline. "It's too fine an evening to spend indoors." Beatrice answered before Madeline could. "What a lovely idea. I was just telling Madeline she works too hard. You young people go enjoy yourselves." Madeline should have protested it wasn't proper to go unchaperoned, but the prospect of an evening in the open air was too tempting. "I need to change first," she said, glancing down at her work dress, spotted with chalk, dust, and ink. "I'll wait," Reed replied, the hint of a smile playing at his lips. An hour later, they were settled on a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree by the same creek where they had spoken months earlier. Reed had come prepared, with a basket containing cold fried chicken, biscuits, pickled vegetables, and even a jar of peach preserves. He'd spread the feast on the blanket and was now pouring coffee from a tin pot he'd set to warm on a small fire. "This is wonderful," Madeline said, accepting the cup he offered. "Thank you, my pleasure." He settled beside her, careful to maintain a respectable distance. "Thought you might appreciate a change of scenery." "I do." She looked around at the gently flowing creek, the rolling hills beyond, the vast sky beginning to take on the golden hue of evening. "It's beautiful here in its own way, different from the forests back home, but beautiful. That's Wyoming for you, beauty you have to learn to see." He took a sip of his coffee. "Ranch is even prettier. Got a view of the mountains from the main house and meadows that fill with wildflowers after the spring rains." It was the first time he'd mentioned his home directly, almost an invitation. Madeline felt a flutter of something, anticipation, perhaps, or anxiety in her chest. "It sounds lovely," she said carefully. They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. A family of ducks paddled by in the creek, the mother leading a line of fluffy ducklings. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Reed said finally. "How long do you plan to stay in Rawlins?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure. I hadn't really thought beyond the school year." He nodded, eyes on the distant hills. "Just wondering, town grows on you after a while." "It has," she admitted. "More than I expected." Reed seemed to be working himself up to say something more, but before he could, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. 3 riders appeared along the creek bank, moving at a leisurely pace. As they drew closer, Madeline recognized them as cowboys she had seen in town, though she didn't know their names. Reed's posture changed subtly, tension entering his shoulders. "Evening, Matthews," he called to the lead rider. "Wilson, Doyle." The men reined in their horses. The one Reed had called Matthews, a thin man with a scar running down one cheek, grinned unpleasantly. "Well, if it ain't Reed Kincaid, bit far from Circle K, ain't you?" His eyes slid to Madeline and his grin widened. "And with company, too." "Evening, madam. Miss Zimmerman is the school teacher in town," Reed said, his voice level but with an undercurrent of warning. "We were just having a picnic supper." Matthews dismounted, his movements slightly unsteady. Madeline could smell the whiskey on him from several feet away. "A picnic, is it? Mighty fine evening for it." He took a step closer and Reed rose to his feet. "You boys headed somewhere?" Reed asked, his tone conversational but his stance anything but. "Just riding back to the bar T," Matthews replied, referring to one of the neighboring ranches. "Thought we might join you for a spell." "Another time," Reed said firmly. "Miss Zimmerman and I were just about to head back to town." The other two cowboys remained mounted, watching the exchange with varying degrees of interest. Wilson, a heavyset man with a bushy beard, looked uncomfortable. Doyle, younger than the others with a shock of red hair, seemed amused. "Don't rush off on our account," Matthews insisted, taking another step forward. "Lady might like some lively company for a change." Reed's hand drifted to his hip, where Madeline noticed for the first time the holstered revolver. "Matthews," he said, his voice dropping dangerously, "you're drunk and you're being disrespectful. Go sleep it off." The tension in the air was palpable. Madeline rose to her feet, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "Mr. Kincaid is right. It's getting late and I should return to town." Matthews looked like he might argue further, but Wilson finally spoke up. "Come on, Jake, leave him be. Boss is expecting us back." For a tense moment, Matthews stood his ground, eyes locked with Reed's. Then he shrugged, a nasty smile spreading across his face. "Another time then, madam." He tipped his hat mockingly to Madeline before remounting his horse. The three riders continued along the creek, Matthews glancing back once with that same unpleasant smile. When they were out of earshot, Reed let out a slow breath. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "Matthews has a reputation for trouble when he's drinking." Madeline's heart was racing, though she'd maintained her composure throughout the encounter. "Is he dangerous?" "Not usually, just mean." Reed began gathering their picnic things, "But I think we should head back now just the same." They packed up quickly, Reed dousing the small fire with water from the creek. He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist as they rode toward town. Madeline was acutely aware of his closeness, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, but her mind was still on the encounter by the creek. "Does that happen often?" she asked. "Men like Matthews, often enough," Reed replied. "Most cowboys are good men just trying to make a living." "But some," he sighed. "The work attracts men who don't fit elsewhere, sometimes for good reason. You seemed prepared for trouble." She felt him shrug behind her. "Man learns to be cautious out here, but don't worry, Matthews is all talk most of the time." They reached the edge of town just as full darkness fell. Reed escorted her to the hotel, both of them aware of the eyes watching from porches and windows. A young, unmarried woman returning after dark with a man, even one as respected as Reed, would be fodder for gossip. "I'll make sure Beatrice knows there was no impropriety," he said quietly as they reached the hotel steps. Those cowboys interrupted what would have been a perfectly respectable picnic. Madeline smiled despite the lingering tension of the evening. "Thank you for your concern for my reputation." "Your reputation and your safety." His eyes were serious in the lantern light. "Madeline, I enjoyed this evening despite the interruption. I'd like to call on you properly if you're amenable." The moment had a weight to it, a significance they both recognized. Reed wasn't proposing marriage, but he was suggesting something more formal than their casual encounters thus far. It was a step Madeline wasn't sure she was ready to take. "Reed, I." She hesitated, torn between the genuine affection she felt for him and the guilt that still shadowed her heart. "I need time," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Time you shall have. Good night, Madeline." She watched him walk away, leading his horse toward the livery stable. Only when he disappeared from view did she enter the hotel, her mind a confused jumble of emotions. That night, she dreamed of Thomas again. This time he was in uniform, mounted on his cavalry horse as she had last seen him alive. "You deserve happiness, Maddie," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Don't use me as an excuse to hide from life." She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a strange lightness in her heart, as if some invisible burden had been lifted. The next day was Sunday, and Madeline attended services at the small church as usual. She noticed whispers and glances from some of the townspeople, confirming her suspicion that her evening with Reed had already become gossip. Beatrice, true to her straightforward nature, addressed it directly as they walked home from church. People are talking about you and Reed Kincaid, she said without preamble. Nothing scandalous, just speculation about whether there's an understanding between you, Madeline sighed. There isn't, not really. But he's asked to call on you last night. I told him I needed time. Beatrice nodded approvingly. Wise, though if you wait too long, someone else might catch his eye. He's considered quite a catch in these parts, owns the largest ranch in the county outright, no debts, and respected by everyone who matters. It's not about his prospects, Madeline protested. It's too soon after Thomas. The older woman's eyes were kind but direct. Is it, or are you afraid to care for someone again, knowing what loss feels like? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Madeline had no ready answer, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. The following week brought a heat wave that made the schoolhouse nearly unbearable by mid-afternoon. Beatrice dismissed the children early on Wednesday, then turned to Madeline with a determined expression. Pack a bag, she said. We're going to the Circle K for a few days. Madeline stared at her. What? Why? Reed invited us last Sunday, said the ranch house is cooler, being up higher with good cross breezes. The children need a break from this heat, and so do we. Her tone brooked no argument. It's perfectly proper. Mrs. Miller and her daughter are coming too. We'll take the wagon, Reed sent. Trapped between propriety and the oppressive heat, Madeline reluctantly agreed. An hour later, she found herself in the back of a wagon with Beatrice, Sarah Miller, and 16-year-old Emma Miller, bouncing along the rough trail that led north from Rawlins. The landscape changed as they traveled, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and sage. After about 2 hours, they crested a rise, and the Circle K spread out before them. The ranch was larger than Madeline had imagined. A substantial 2-story house of hewn logs stood on a gentle slope, surrounded by various outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, smithy, and several corrals where horses milled in the afternoon sun. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and in the distance, the dark line of mountains formed a dramatic backdrop. Reed met them at the main house, helping each woman down from the wagon with careful courtesy. When he reached for Madeline's hand, their eyes met briefly, a current of unspoken feeling passing between them. Welcome to Circle K, he said, his voice warm. I hope you'll find it comfortable. The house was surprisingly refined inside, with polished wood floors, good furniture, and even a few pieces of art on the walls. Reed showed them to their rooms. Madeline and Emma would share one, Beatrice and Sarah another, then invited them to rest before the evening meal. The men eat in the bunkhouse, he explained, but I take my meals here in the main house. I'd be honored if you ladies would join me. Dinner was a revelation. Reed's cook, an elderly Mexican woman named Alina, served tender roast beef, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, and biscuits that melted in the mouth. The dining room windows were open to catch the evening breeze, making the room pleasantly cool compared to the stifling heat of Rawlins. Conversation flowed easily, with Sarah Miller doing most of the talking, sharing town gossip and inquiring about ranch operations. Reed answered her questions politely, but Madeline noticed his eyes straying to her frequently, gauging her reactions, seeking her thoughts. After dinner, they moved to the porch, where Reed offered brandy to the older women and lemonade to Emma and Madeline. As darkness fell, the vast Wyoming sky came alive with stars, more brilliant here, away from even the modest lights of town. It's magnificent, Madeline said softly, gazing upward. It is, Reed agreed, standing beside her at the porch railing. Never gets old, no matter how many times I see it. Sarah and Beatrice had engaged Emma in a game of cards at a small table behind them, giving Reed and Madeline a moment of relative privacy. Thank you for inviting us, she said. It's a welcome respite from the heat. My pleasure. I've been wanting to show you the ranch for some time. He hesitated, then added, I'm glad you came, even if it took Beatrice's insistence. Madeline smiled. She can be persuasive. That she can. Reed's voice grew serious. Madeline, about what I asked the other night, Reed, she interrupted gently, I'm still not sure. Being here, seeing all you've built, it's impressive, intimidating even. He looked surprised. Intimidating. You have a life here, a purpose. I'm still finding mine. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You think I'd expect you to just fit into mine, isn't that what men usually expect? Reed was quiet for a moment, considering, maybe some do, but that's not what I want. He turned to face her fully. I've watched you these past months building a life for yourself despite your grief, teaching those children, becoming part of the community on your own terms. That's the woman I admire, not someone who'd simply fit into the space I might make for her. His words touched her deeply, addressing fears she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything yet. His smile was gentle. Just know that whatever happens between us, I'd never ask you to be less than who you are. The moment was broken by Sarah calling from the table. Reed, do you play whist? We need a fourth. He excused himself to join the card game, leaving Madeline to her thoughts. She remained at the railing, watching the stars and pondering his words, feeling something shift within her heart. The next day, Reed gave them a tour of the ranch. They rode in a light buggy, visiting the various pastures where different ages of cattle grazed, the spring-fed pond that provided water even in the driest summers, and finally, a high meadow filled with wildflowers where they stopped for a picnic lunch. While Beatrice, Sarah, and Emma explored the meadow, Reed and Madeline walked to a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding country. My father and I stood right here the day we bought this land, Reed said, gazing out at the landscape. It was nothing then, just empty prairie with a broken-down line shack where the main house stands now. Pa looked out and said, "Son, this is where we start again." He would be proud of what you've built, Madeline said softly. I hope so. Reed's expression was distant, remembering. He worked himself to death making this place, never complained, even when his hands were so cracked and bleeding he could barely hold the reins. He shook himself slightly, returning to the present. Sorry, don't mean to get melancholy. Don't apologize, I like hearing about him, about you. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. Beatrice mentioned you lost someone during the war. Would you tell me about her? If the question surprised him, he didn't show it. Her name was Alice. We grew up together in Missouri, knew each other since we were children. A sad smile touched his lips. Nothing formal between us, we were too young, but everyone assumed we'd marry someday. What happened? I enlisted when the fighting got close to home. She wrote to me every week, then the letters stopped. He looked down at his hands, strong and calloused. Typhoid swept through our town while I was gone, took her, my little sister, and a dozen others. I'm sorry, Madeline said, meaning it deeply. Reed nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. Took me years to stop looking for her letters. Even after I knew she was gone, part of me expected to see her handwriting whenever mail came. His eyes met Madeline's, full of understanding. That's how grief is. Doesn't matter if it's a sweetheart, a fiancé, or a spouse. Loss is loss. His words, spoken without self-pity, but with profound empathy, broke something open inside Madeline. For the first time, she spoke freely about Thomas, not just the sanitized version she'd shared before, but the complicated truth of their relationship. We argued the day before he left on that last mission, she admitted. Something trivial, the guest list for the wedding. He wanted to invite his entire company, and I thought it would be too many. She shook her head at the memory. I was so concerned about propriety, about what my parents would think of a rowdy military wedding. Now I'd give anything to have that day, however it might have been. Reed listened without interrupting, offering only the comfort of his attention. When she finally fell silent, he said quietly, "The hardest part isn't losing them, it's learning to forgive yourself for going on living." Yes, she whispered, the truth of it resonating within her. Exactly that. They stood together in silence for a long moment, sharing an understanding that needed no words. Then Reed gently placed his hand over hers where it rested on the sun-warmed rock. "We should get back to the others," he said. "But thank you for telling me about Thomas, for trusting me with that." That evening, after another excellent meal, Reed brought out a fiddle and played for them on the porch. His skill surprised Madeline. The music was lively and accomplished, toe-tapping reels giving way to haunting ballads that seemed to capture the vastness of the Wyoming night. As she listened, Madeline realized something had changed within her. The weight of grief, while not gone, had shifted somehow, becoming bearable in a way it hadn't been before. And in its place, something new was growing, a cautious hope, a tentative reaching toward the future. The next morning, as they prepared to return to town, Reed pulled Madeline aside while the others were loading the wagon. "I meant what I said before," he told her, "about calling on you properly, but I understand if you need more time." Madeline looked up at him, this man who had built a life from nothing, who understood loss but hadn't let it define him. In his eyes she saw patience, respect, and something warmer that made her heart quicken. "I think," she said slowly, "I would like that very much." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains. "Sunday, after church." "Sunday," she agreed, and was rewarded with the brief, warm pressure of his hand on hers before they rejoined the others. The return to Rollins brought a return to routine, but with subtle differences. Madeline found herself looking forward to Sunday with an anticipation that both excited and frightened her. Was she ready for this step? Was it too soon? The questions circled in her mind as she taught her classes and prepared her lessons. On Saturday afternoon, Madeline was in the schoolhouse alone, writing assignments on the blackboard for the following week, when the door opened. Expecting Beatrice, she turned with a smile that froze when she saw Jake Matthews leaning against the doorframe. "Afternoon, school teacher," he drawled, hat pushed back on his head. He was sober today, which somehow made his presence more rather than less menacing. "Mr. Matthews," she acknowledged stiffly. "The school is closed until Monday." He sauntered into the room, ignoring her implied dismissal. "Just thought I'd stop by, seeing as how our last meeting got cut short." His eyes roamed over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You and Kincaid seemed mighty cozy by that creek." Madeline set down her chalk and moved behind the teacher's desk, putting a barrier between them. "Mr. Kincaid was kind enough to escort me on a picnic. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Matthews didn't leave. Instead, he perched on one of the student desks, toying with a pencil left behind. "Kincaid thinks mighty highly of himself for a man who started with nothing. Acts like he's better than the rest of us just 'cause he's got some land and cattle." There was an ugly undertone to his words that raised the hair on Madeline's neck. "Mr. Kincaid has never been anything but civil to me." "Oh, I bet he has." Matthews's smile was unpleasant. "Thing is, I've been watching you these past months. Pretty Eastern lady all alone, playing at being a teacher." He leaned forward. "You could do better than Kincaid, you know. Bar Titakes nearly as big as Circle K these days." The implication was clear and revolting. Madeline gathered her papers with hands she fought to keep steady. "I believe this conversation is over, Mr. Matthews. Please leave." He rose from the desk, moving to block her path to the door. "Now don't be unfriendly. I'm just offering an alternative." "Man like Kincaid's got too many principles. Boring, if you ask me." "I didn't ask you," Madeline replied, anger overtaking her fear. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd leave now before I call for the sheriff." Matthews laughed. "Sheriff Potts. He's out at the Madison place investigating some stolen horses. Won't be back till tomorrow." He took a step closer. "Nobody around to hear you if you did call out." Madeline's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "Mr. Wilson and Mr. Doyle seem to have some sense of decency. Do they know you're here, harassing a woman alone?" The mention of his companions seemed to give Matthews pause. "They ain't my keepers." "Perhaps not, but I imagine they and others in town might have something to say about your behavior." She straightened her spine, channeling every ounce of her Philadelphia upbringing. "You forget yourself, Mr. Matthews. I am the school teacher in this town and you are trespassing. Leave now or face the consequences." For a tense moment, they stared at each other across the small classroom. Then, to Madeline's immense relief, the sound of approaching footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside broke the standoff. Matthews glanced toward the door, then back at her. "Another time, schoolteacher," he said, tipping his hat mockingly before striding out the back door of the classroom just as Beatrice entered through the front. "Madeline, are you all right? You look pale." The older woman's sharp eyes took in Madeline's shaken appearance. "I'm fine, just had an unwelcome visitor." Madeline sank into her chair, her knees suddenly weak. "Jake Matthews." Beatrice's expression darkened. "What did that scoundrel want? To intimidate me, I think, and to insult Reed." Madeline shuddered slightly. "There's something wrong with that man, Beatrice. Something dangerous. You're not wrong there. Beatrice placed a comforting hand on Madeline's shoulder. Matthews has had run-ins with half the men in the county. Got fired from 3 ranches before landing at the bar T, and they only keep him on because he's handy with breaking horses that no one else can ride. Madeline took a deep breath, steadying herself. He mentioned Sheriff Potts is out of town. Until tomorrow, yes. Beatrice's concern deepened. Did he threaten you, dear? Not in so many words, just implications. Madeline straightened her papers, needing the simple, orderly task to calm her nerves. I'm fine, really. He's just a bully. Beatrice didn't look convinced. You shouldn't be alone until the sheriff returns. Why don't you come stay at my boarding house tonight? Mrs. Jessup always has a spare room. Madeline hesitated, not wanting to appear frightened, but the prospect of returning alone to her hotel room suddenly seemed unappealing. Thank you, I think I will. That evening, ensconced in the cozy spare room at Mrs. Jessup's boarding house, Madeline wrote in her journal, trying to make sense of the day's events. The encounter with Matthews had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, highlighting how vulnerable she was as a woman alone in this frontier town. Yet she had stood her ground, found her voice in a moment of fear. There was strength in that realization. She thought of Reed, of their conversation on the rocky outcrop at Circle K, of the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Tomorrow he would call on her officially, taking a step toward something more formal between them. The prospect filled her with both anticipation and anxiety. Was she ready? Was it too soon after Thomas? But as she extinguished her lamp and lay in the unfamiliar bed, Madeline realized that too soon was a concept that belonged to Philadelphia, to a world of rigid social rules and prescribed mourning periods. Here in Wyoming, life moved according to different rhythms, dictated by necessity and the heart's own timetable. Thomas had been gone for nearly 4 months. In those months, she had built the beginnings of a new life teaching, finding her place in this community, and yes, opening her heart to the possibility of caring for someone new. Not as a replacement for Thomas that could never be, but as a continuation of life's journey. When Reed arrived at the boarding house the next afternoon, freshly shaved and wearing his Sunday best, Madeline greeted him with a decision already made in her heart. They walked together through town to the creek that had become their unofficial meeting place, now busy with families seeking relief from the Sunday afternoon heat. Reed spread a blanket in a shady spot, maintaining a respectable distance from other groups. I heard about Matthews, he said as they settled on the blanket. Beatrice told me this morning after church. Madeline wasn't surprised. News traveled fast in small towns. He was unpleasant, but I handled it. Reed's expression was troubled. He's dangerous, Madeline. I should have warned you more clearly after our picnic. I'm fine, she insisted. But I appreciate your concern. He studied her face, then seemed to come to a decision. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. I was going to wait, make this more formal, but after hearing about Matthews, he handed her the package. I want you to have this. Curious, Madeline unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small Derringer pistol elegantly made with a pearl handle. Reed, it was my mother's, he explained. Pa gave it to her when they came west. It's small enough to carry in a pocket or reticule, but it'll stop a man if needed. His eyes met hers, serious and intent. I pray you never need to use it, but I'd sleep better knowing you have it. The gift was intensely personal, both in its history and its implication of his concern for her safety. Madeline ran a finger along the smooth pearl handle, considering. I don't know how to use it, she admitted. I can teach you. Reed's voice was gentle but firm. It's simple enough. Madeline nodded slowly. Thank you, I'll accept it and your instruction. Relief showed in his face. Good, we can practice at the ranch away from curious eyes. He hesitated, then added, which brings me to what I really wanted to discuss today. Oh. Madeline carefully rewrapped the pistol and placed it in her reticule. Reed took a deep breath. Madeline, I care for you, more than I've cared for anyone since, well, in a very long time. I'm not asking for promises yet, but I want to court you properly, with the understanding that my intentions are honorable, and, if you'll have me someday, permanent. Though she had expected something of the sort, hearing the words spoken aloud made Madeline's heart race. Reed was offering her not just affection, but a future, a life built together in this wild country. "I care for you too," she said softly. "And yes, I would like that very much." The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the plains. Without breaking propriety, he reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "You've made me very happy." "There's something I need to tell you first," Madeline said, her expression growing serious. "About Thomas." Reed waited, patient and attentive. "After I received news of his death, I was lost. I stayed in Wyoming partly because I couldn't face returning home in defeat, but mostly because I felt I owed it to his memory." She took a deep breath. "But these past months, especially since meeting you, I've realized something. Thomas would want me to live fully to find happiness again. He was generous that way." Reed nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That doesn't mean you love him any less." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but it means I'm ready to look forward, not just backward." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm ready, Reed." The weeks that followed were the happiest Madeline had known since coming west. Reed called on her regularly, taking her on drives in his buggy, escorting her to church socials, and bringing her to Circle K on Sundays for dinner. Always they were properly chaperoned, usually by Beatrice, who watched their blossoming courtship with undisguised approval. True to his word, Reed taught Madeline to use the derringer during these visits to the ranch. She proved a quick study, and while she hoped never to need the weapon, its presence in her reticule gave her a sense of security, especially after her encounter with Matthews. The cowboy hadn't approached her again, but she occasionally caught sight of him watching her from across the street when she was in town, his expression unreadable but unsettling. She mentioned these incidents to Reed, who grew increasingly concerned. "Bar T hands aren't welcome at Circle K anymore," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch at the ranch, Beatrice dozing in a rocking chair nearby. "I've made that clear to their foreman, and I've spoken to Sheriff Potts about Matthews." "What did the sheriff say?" Madeline asked. Reed's expression was grim. "That he can't do anything unless Matthews actually breaks the law, but he promised to keep an eye on him when he's in town." Summer gave way to fall, the days growing shorter and cooler. The school term continued, with several new students joining as families settled in the area before winter. Madeline found herself increasingly comfortable in her role as teacher, developing her own methods rather than simply following Beatrice's lead. Reed's courtship continued at a measured pace, respectful of Madeline's recent loss yet growing deeper with each passing week. They discovered shared interests, a love of music, of literature, of quiet evenings under the stars. They also found differences. Reed's practical approach to life sometimes clashed with Madeline's more idealistic view, but these differences sparked interesting conversations rather than conflict. By late October, as the first snows dusted the higher elevations, Madeline knew with certainty that she was falling in love with Reed Kincaid. The realization brought both joy and a lingering sadness, joy in finding such unexpected happiness. Sadness in the knowledge that loving again meant finally, truly letting Thomas go. It was on a crisp November afternoon, with the scent of wood smoke in the air and the promise of winter on the wind, that everything changed. Madeline had dismissed her students early due to the first heavy snowfall of the season, wanting them to reach their homes before the weather worsened. Beatrice had left immediately, heading for the boarding house with a lingering cold that concerned Madeline. Left alone, Madeline was gathering her teaching materials when the schoolhouse door opened, letting in a swirl of snowflakes and Jake Matthews. He was alone, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes hard and cold as the weather outside. "Afternoon, schoolteacher," he drawled, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Thought I might catch you alone." Madeline's hand moved instinctively to her reticule where the derringer rested. "Mr. Matthews." "School is dismissed for the day. Ain't here for schooling." He moved further into the room, blocking the path to the door. "Been watching you and Kincaid. Getting mighty cozy, ain't you?" Fear prickled along Madeline's spine, but she kept her voice steady. "My relationship with Mr. Kincaid is none of your concern." Matthews laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "See, that's where you're wrong. Kincaid's been a thorn in my side since I came to Wyoming. Acts like he owns the whole territory just 'cause he got here first. He took another step closer. Taking his woman would be satisfying. Madeline's fingers closed around the derringer in her reticule, but she didn't draw it yet. Mr. Matthews, I'm going to ask you once to leave. If you don't, there will be consequences, he laughed again. You threatening me, schoolteacher, with what? In a swift motion, Madeline withdrew the derringer and pointed it steadily at Matthews's chest. With this, Reed taught me how to use it. Matthews froze, surprise registering on his face before it was replaced with anger. You wouldn't dare. I absolutely would. Madeline's voice was calm despite her racing heart. Now back away from the door. For a tense moment, neither moved. Then Matthews took a slow step backward, his eyes never leaving the pistol. You think this changes anything? You think Kincaid can protect you all the time? I can protect myself, Madeline replied. As I'm demonstrating right now, keep backing up. Matthews took another reluctant step back, his expression darkening. This ain't over. The schoolhouse door suddenly opened again, and Sheriff Potts stepped inside, his bulky form filling the doorframe. He took in the scene at a glance, Madeline with the derringer, Matthews with his hands half raised. Problem here, Miss Zimmerman? The sheriff asked mildly, though his hand rested on his own holstered revolver. Mr. Matthews was just leaving, Madeline said, keeping the derringer trained on the cowboy. Weren't you, Mr. Matthews? Matthews's face contorted with rage, but he was caught. With the sheriff as witness, any move against Madeline would land him in jail. This ain't over, he repeated, then pushed past the sheriff and out into the snowy afternoon. Sheriff Potts watched him go, then turned back to Madeline. You all right, Miss Zimmerman? Madeline lowered the derringer, suddenly aware that her hand was shaking. Yes. Thank you for arriving when you did. Saw him heading this way, figured he might be up to no good. The sheriff's weathered face was concerned. Want me to walk you back to your hotel, please? Madeline carefully replaced the derringer in her reticule. Sheriff, he threatened me, and Reed. Potts nodded gravely. I heard. That's enough to hold him if you want to make a formal complaint, Madeline considered. If Matthews were arrested, it would mean a trial, her name linked with his in public testimony. But if he remained free, yes, I want to make a complaint. The sheriff escorted her first to the hotel, where she gathered a few belongings, then to his office, where she gave a formal statement about Matthews's threats. By the time they finished, the snow was falling heavily and darkness had settled over Rollins. I'll send one of my deputies out to the bar T to arrest Matthews, Potts said as they concluded. In the meantime, might be best if you stayed somewhere other than the hotel tonight. Matthews has friends who might take exception to his arrest. I can stay at the boarding house with Beatrice, Madeline decided. I'll walk you there. The sheriff reached for his coat, then paused at a knock on the door. Reed Kincaid stood on the threshold, snow coating his hat and shoulders. His eyes found Madeline immediately, relief washing over his features. Thank God, I heard what happened. News traveled fast in small towns, especially bad news. Madeline rose from her chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the afternoon. Reed crossed the room in 2 strides, propriety forgotten as he gathered her into his arms. Are you all right? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. I am now, she whispered, allowing herself to draw strength from his embrace. Sheriff Potts cleared his throat discreetly. Kincaid, I was just telling Miss Zimmerman she shouldn't stay at the hotel tonight. Matthews made some pretty specific threats. Reed's arms tightened around her. She'll come to Circle K. It's the safest place for her right now. Madeline pulled back slightly to look at him. The roads will be dangerous in this snow. I brought the sleigh, Reed replied. We'll be fine. The decision was made quickly after that. Sheriff Potts would send deputies to arrest Matthews, while Reed would take Madeline to Circle K until the situation was resolved. A stop at the boarding house to inform Beatrice of the plan, and to receive her approval as chaperone, though she was too ill to accompany them, completed the preparations. As they glided through the snowy night in Reed's sleigh, warm beneath buffalo robes despite the cold, Madeline felt an odd sense of peace descend. The danger wasn't past. Matthews's threats still hung in the air, but beside Reed, with the vast Wyoming wilderness spread around them, she felt safer than she had in the schoolhouse with a pistol in her hand. I was proud of you today, Reed said, breaking the comfortable silence. Using the derringer, standing your ground, not many women would have had that courage. I was terrified, Madeline admitted, but something Thomas said once came to mind. He told me that courage isn't the absence of fear but action despite it. Reed nodded. Wise man, he was. She looked up at Reed, his profile strong against the snowy landscape. He would have liked you, I think. Reed glanced down at her, surprise and then a deeper emotion crossing his face. That's quite a compliment coming from you. They lapsed into silence again, but it was a silence full of unspoken feeling. As Circle K came into view, lights glowing warmly in the main house windows, Madeline knew with sudden clarity that this was where she belonged. Not because it was Reed's home, but because it could be hers too, a place to build a future, to create a life that honored the past without being bound by it. Reed helped her from the sleigh, his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary. In the lantern light from the porch, his eyes were serious as they met hers. Madeline, he began, then hesitated. This isn't how I planned this. I had something more romantic in mind, but today made me realize that life's too uncertain to wait for perfect moments. Her heart began to race as he took her gloved hands in his. I love you, he said simply. I think I started falling in love with you that first day by the creek when you were so brave in your grief. I've watched you build a life here, face challenges with grace and courage, open your heart despite having known loss. He took a deep breath. I'm asking you to marry me, not to replace what you had with Thomas, but to build something new together. Snow fell gently around them, each flake catching the lantern light like a tiny star. Madeline looked up at this man who had taught her that life could contain both grief and joy, that the heart was capable of loving deeply more than once. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain in the snowy night. Yes, Reed, I love you, and I want to build that future with you. His smile was radiant as he drew her into his arms, his kiss warm despite the cold night air. For a long moment they stood together, wrapped in the promise of tomorrow, while the snow continued to fall around them like a blessing. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world transformed by several inches of fresh snow. Madeline woke in the guest room at Circle K, momentarily disoriented before remembering the events of the previous day. Matthews's threats, the sleigh ride through the snow, and Reed's proposal under the falling flakes. A sense of peace settled over her. Despite the danger Matthews represented, despite the impropriety of staying at Reed's ranch without Beatrice as chaperone, though Alina the cook served as a more than adequate guardian of her reputation, Madeline felt certain of her path forward. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where she found Reed at the dining table with a pot of coffee and several sheets of paper covered in his neat handwriting. Good morning, he said, rising as she entered. His smile was warm, his eyes taking in her appearance with undisguised appreciation. Did you sleep well? Better than I expected, she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he poured for her. What are you working on so early? Reed gestured to the papers. Lists. Things that need doing before winter sets in fully, and now, wedding preparations to consider. The casual mention of their engagement brought a rush of happiness. I thought perhaps a small ceremony, Madeline said, taking a seat across from him. Just close friends from town. Whatever you want, Reed replied, though I admit I'd prefer sooner rather than later. Eager Mr. Kincaid, she teased, surprising herself with her boldness, his eyes darkened slightly. Very Miss Zimmerman. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Reed rose to answer it, returning a moment later with Sheriff Potts stamping snow from his boots. Morning, Miss Zimmerman, Kincaid. The sheriff accepted the coffee Reed offered, warming his hands around the cup. Thought you'd want to know Matthews wasn't at the bar tea when my deputies arrived last night. Reed's expression hardened. He ran. Looks that way. According to the foreman, Matthews collected his pay and lit out just after sundown, heading south. Potts took a sip of his coffee. Could be coincidence, but more likely he figured Miss Zimmerman would report him and decided to clear out. Will you search for him? Madeline asked. The sheriff sighed. I've sent telegrams to the neighboring counties, but with this snow, tracking him won't be easy. And truth be told, if he's left the area, that might be the best outcome for everyone. Reed didn't look convinced. Matthews isn't the type to let go of a grudge. If he's running, it's to regroup, not to give up. Maybe, Potts conceded, but for now he's gone. Miss Zimmerman, I'll need you to come into town today or tomorrow to sign your formal statement, make it official in case he does return. I'll bring her in today, Reed said. We have business in town anyway. After the sheriff departed, Reed turned to Madeline, his expression troubled. I don't like this. Matthews disappearing rather than facing arrest makes me uneasy. What can we do? Madeline asked. Be vigilant. I'll let my men know to watch for him. Reed's jaw set determinedly. And we'll move forward with our plans. I won't let him cast a shadow over our future. They traveled to Rawlins that afternoon, the sleigh making good time on the packed snow. In town, they visited Sheriff Potts's office first, where Madeline signed her formal statement. Then, to her surprise, Reed directed the sleigh to the small church at the edge of town. I thought we might speak to Reverend Williams about a wedding date, Reed explained as he helped her down from the sleigh. Unless you'd prefer to wait, Madeline shook her head. No, I'd like that. Reverend Williams, a kindly man in his 50s who had come west for his health, welcomed them warmly. When they explained their intention to marry, he offered heartfelt congratulations. I've watched you both these past months, he said. It's been a blessing to see how God works, bringing healing and new beginnings from sorrow. He consulted his calendar. I could perform the ceremony as early as next Saturday if that suits you. Madeline and Reed exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Next Saturday would be perfect, Reed said. A small ceremony, just close friends. And Madeline's parents, the Reverend asked. Will they be traveling from the east? The question gave Madeline pause. She had written to her parents about Reed, but not about their deepening relationship. The distance between Wyoming and Philadelphia made regular correspondence difficult. It often took weeks for letters to arrive. Her parents didn't even know yet that she had decided to remain in Rawlins permanently. There isn't time for them to make the journey, she said finally. I'll write to them, of course. Reverend Williams nodded understandingly. Well then, next Saturday it is, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. With the date set, they continued their errands in town. Reed insisted on visiting the general store, where he encouraged Madeline to select fabric for new dresses, including a wedding gown. Nothing elaborate, she protested. There isn't time for anything fancy. Whatever you choose will be beautiful, Reed replied. But you should have something special for the day. Sarah Miller, delighted by the news of their engagement, offered to help with the sewing. Emma and I can have a simple gown ready by next week, if you don't mind something straightforward. Straightforward is perfect, Madeline assured her, selecting a cream-colored silk that Sarah had been saving for a special customer. Just like Wyoming. Their final stop was the boarding house to check on Beatrice. The elderly teacher was recovering from her cold but still looked frail. Nevertheless, her eyes brightened at their news. About time, she declared. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the schoolhouse to get a proposal. Reed laughed. Your faith in my intentions is flattering, Beatrice. The older woman's expression softened. I've known you since you were a young man fresh from the war, Reed Kincaid. Watched you build that ranch from nothing but hard work and determination. There's no man I'd rather see Madeline marry. Her approval meant more to Madeline than she could express. In many ways, Beatrice had become the mother figure she needed in this new life, offering guidance without judgment, support without smothering. Will you stand with me at the ceremony? Madeline asked impulsively. In place of my mother, tears glistened in Beatrice's faded eyes. I would be honored, my dear. That evening, back at Circle K, Madeline wrote a long letter to her parents, explaining everything: her decision to stay in Wyoming, her engagement to Reed, and the hastened wedding date. She described Reed as best she could, his character and accomplishments, the respect he commanded in the community, and most importantly, how he had helped her find joy again after losing Thomas. Whether they would understand her choices remained to be seen, but she felt she owed them the truth, however belatedly. The next week passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Rawlins, met with general approval and a few good-natured comments about how everyone had seen it coming except, perhaps, the couple themselves. There was no further news of Jake Matthews, which both relieved and unsettled Madeline. Sheriff Potts reported that none of the neighboring counties had seen him, suggesting he had traveled farther south, perhaps to Colorado or even New Mexico Territory. Good riddance, was Beatrice's opinion, expressed forcefully as she helped Madeline with her first fitting for the wedding gown. That man was nothing but trouble from the day he arrived. Madeline wished she could share the older woman's certainty, but something about Matthews's disappearance left her uneasy. The intensity of his hatred for Reed had seemed too personal, too deeply rooted to be abandoned so easily. Still, as the wedding day approached, her concerns about Matthews receded, replaced by a growing anticipation. She had never expected to find love again, certainly not so soon after losing Thomas. Yet here she was, preparing to marry a man who understood her grief because he had walked the same path, who valued her independence as much as her affection, who saw her as a partner in building a future rather than an accessory to his life. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the snow glistening under a bright December sun. Madeline dressed with Sarah and Emma's help in the private room at the back of the general store that Sarah used for fittings. The cream silk gown was simple but elegant, with a fitted bodice and sleeves of delicate lace that Sarah had been saving for a special occasion. "Something borrowed," Beatrice said, arriving as they were arranging Madeline's hair. From her pocket, she withdrew a small blue handkerchief edged with tatted lace. "My mother carried this at her wedding. I carried it at mine. Now you carry it at yours." Emotion tightened Madeline's throat. "Thank you," she managed, carefully tucking the handkerchief into her sleeve. "And something new," Sarah added, presenting a small box. Inside was a pair of pearl earrings, simple but lovely. "From all of us in Rawlins who have come to think of you as family." Tears threatened to spill over, but Madeline blinked them back, not wanting to arrive at her wedding with reddened eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll wear them," Emma suggested practically, and they all laughed. The church was filled when they arrived, every resident of Rawlins who could manage it having turned out for the occasion. As Madeline entered on Sheriff Potts's arm, the closest thing to a father figure available, he had gruffly offered his services. Her eyes found Reed immediately, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit. The love in his eyes as he watched her approach nearly undid her composure. This man, who had built a life from nothing in this harsh land, who had known loss and persevered, who had shown her that grief and joy could coexist in the same heart, this man was to be her husband. Reverend Williams's ceremony was brief, but meaningful, incorporating elements of traditional wedding services while acknowledging the unique circumstances that had brought Madeline and Reed together. When they exchanged vows, Madeline's voice was clear and steady, her promise to love, honor, and cherish Reed coming from the depths of her heart. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend declared, and as Reed's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, Madeline felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. The celebration afterward at the hotel dining room was joyous, with music provided by local talent, including Reed on his fiddle playing a special piece for his new bride. Dancing and feasting continued well into the evening, the entire town seeming determined to mark the occasion thoroughly. As the celebration wound down, Reed and Madeline prepared to depart for Circle K, now their shared home. Friends gathered outside the hotel to see them off, tossing rice and calling good wishes as Reed helped Madeline into the sleigh. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the black Wyoming sky as they glided over the snow toward home. Reed's arm was warm around Madeline's shoulders, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "Happy, Mrs. Kincaid?" he asked softly as the lights of Rawlins faded behind them. "Very, Mr. Kincaid," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I think it might take some time to get used to my new name." "We have all the time in the world," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. The ranch house came into view, windows glowing with welcoming light. Elena had stayed behind to prepare for their return, and as Reed helped Madeline from the sleigh, the delicious aroma of a celebratory supper wafted from the kitchen. "Welcome home," Reed said, his voice deep with emotion as they stood together on the porch of what was now their shared home. In that moment, with the stars overhead and the man she loved beside her, Madeline felt the last shadows of grief recede. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, but now that heart had expanded, making room for new love, new dreams, new beginnings. "Home," she echoed, and took her husband's hand to cross the threshold into their future together. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, the snow melting by mid-March to reveal the first tender shoots of green. Circle K flourished under Reed and Madeline's joint stewardship, with calving season bringing a bumper crop of healthy new stock that promised prosperity for the year to come. Madeline had continued teaching through the winter, making the daily journey to town when weather permitted, staying overnight at the boarding house when it didn't. But as the school year drew to a close, she and Reed had decided she would not return in the fall. The ranch demanded attention, and they had begun to speak of starting a family of their own. Life had settled into a rhythm of shared work and joy. Reed had incorporated Madeline fully into the running of Circle K, valuing her organizational skills and fresh perspective. Together, they had expanded the ranch's operations, adding a small apple orchard and a larger kitchen garden, improvements that would make them more self-sufficient in the years to come. There had been no further sign of Jake Matthews. Sheriff Potts's inquiries had eventually tracked him to Denver, where he had reportedly taken work with a cattle outfit heading for Texas. The distance eased Madeline's lingering concerns, though she still kept Reed's mother's derringer close at hand when traveling alone. On a warm May afternoon, Madeline sat on the porch, writing letters, one to her parents, with whom she now corresponded regularly, and one to Beatrice, who had retired from teaching at the end of the school year and moved to Denver to live with her niece. The ranch spread before her, green and thriving in the spring sunshine, a physical manifestation of the life she and Reed were building together. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up, expecting to see Reed returning from checking the northern pastures. Instead, a lone rider she didn't recognize approached the house. Setting aside her letters, Madeline rose, one hand instinctively moving to the pocket where the derringer rested. As the rider drew closer, she saw he was a young man, perhaps 20, with the dust of long travel on his clothes. He reined in his horse at a respectful distance from the porch. "Mrs. Kincaid," he called, removing his hat. "Madam, I've got a message for you and your husband." "My husband is checking the herds," Madeline replied, keeping her hand near her pocket. "He should return shortly. Who are you?" "Name's Billy Renfrew, madam. I work for the bar T." Seeing her stiffen, he added hastily, "Don't worry, I ain't friends with Matthews. That's actually why I'm here." Madeline's wariness increased. "What about Matthews?" "He's back, madam." Billy's expression was grim. "Rode into the bar T 2 days ago, drunk and talking crazy. Said he had unfinished business with Reed Kincaid and his fancy Eastern wife." A chill ran down Madeline's spine despite the warm afternoon. "Did he threaten us specifically?" Billy nodded. "Yes." "Said he was going to make Kincaid pay for humiliating him. Boss fired him on the spot, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "Matthews just laughed and rode off. Boss sent me to warn you and Mr. Kincaid to be careful." "Thank you for coming," Madeline said, her mind racing. "Would you like some water for yourself and your horse before you head back?" "Thank you, madam." Billy dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough while Madeline fetched a cup of water from the kitchen. As Billy drank, hoofbeats announced Reed's return. He rode into the yard, his expression questioning as he took in the unexpected visitor. "Reed," Madeline called, "this is Billy Renfrew from the bar T. He has news." Reed dismounted, his eyes alert as Billy repeated his warning. When the young man finished, Reed's face was grave. "You did right to come tell us," he said, pressing some coins into Billy's hand despite the young man's protests. "Ride safe going back." When Billy had departed, Reed turned to Madeline, concern etched on his features. "I want you to stay close to the house until we know where Matthews is. Don't go anywhere alone, not even to town." Madeline nodded, knowing this was no time for assertions of independence. "Do you think he'll really try something? Matthews is unstable and has a personal hatred for me that goes beyond reason." Reed ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as a sign of deep worry. I'll ride into town tomorrow, let Sheriff Potts know he's back in the area. That night, Madeline lay awake long after Reed had fallen asleep, her mind turning over the threat Matthews represented. The happiness she and Reed had found seemed suddenly fragile, vulnerable to the hatred of one disturbed man. She thought of Thomas, of how swiftly and unexpectedly death had claimed him. The idea of losing Reed the same way was unbearable. Yet she refused to live in fear, to allow Matthews to cast a shadow over the life they were building. Beside her, Reed stirred, reaching for her even in sleep. His arm settled around her waist, pulling her close against his solid warmth. The simple, unconscious gesture reassured her. They would face this together, as they had faced every challenge since their marriage. With that thought, she finally drifted into sleep. The next few days passed in a state of heightened vigilance. Reed rode into Rawlins to inform Sheriff Potts, who promised to keep watch for Matthews and to notify neighboring settlements. Reed also sent word to the outlying ranches, ensuring everyone in the area was aware of the potential threat. Life at Circle K continued. Cattle still needed tending, crops still needed planting, but with a new caution. Reed made sure Madeline was never alone, either accompanying her himself or assigning one of his most trusted ranch hands to stay near the house when he couldn't be there. 3 days after Billy's warning, Reed had to ride to a neighboring ranch to help with a difficult calving. Madeline spent the day with Alina, preserving the last of the previous year's apples and planning the expanded garden they would plant in the coming weeks. Evening approached with no sign of Reed. Madeline tried not to worry. The calving might have presented complications, or he might have decided to wait until morning to make the journey home. Still, a sense of unease grew as darkness fell. She and Alina had just finished supper when they heard a commotion outside. Madeline's heart leapt, expecting Reed, but instead, one of the ranch hands, young Tim Sanders, burst through the door, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Mrs. Kincaid," he gasped. Matthews. He ambushed the boss on his way back from the Peterson place, shot at him from the rocks along Miller's Creek. Madeline's blood ran cold. "Reed is he's alive," Tim assured her quickly. "Bullet just grazed his arm, but Matthews got away in the confusion. Boss sent me to warn you while he and the others try to track him." Alina immediately went to Tim, examining his wound while Madeline tried to think clearly through her fear. "How many men are with Reed?" "Just Carlos and Hank. We weren't expecting trouble in daylight." 3 men against Matthews, who had the advantage of knowing he was being pursued, and if Reed was injured even slightly. "Tim, I need you to ride to town for Sheriff Potts," Madeline decided. "Alina will bandage your head, then you go immediately. Tell the sheriff what's happened and that Matthews may be heading for Circle K." The young cowboy nodded, wincing as Alina dabbed at his wound with a damp cloth. "Yes." While Alina tended to Tim, Madeline went to the gun cabinet in Reed's study, removing a Winchester rifle and loading it with steady hands. She had learned to shoot in the months since her marriage, Reed insisting that every ranch wife should know how to defend herself and her home. She positioned herself by the window, rifle ready, watching the darkness beyond the pool of light cast by the house lanterns. Alina, after seeing Tim off to town, joined her with a shotgun of her own. "He will not come to the house," the older woman said confidently. "Even Matthews is not so stupid." Madeline wasn't so sure. The man had already demonstrated a recklessness that bordered on the suicidal, ambushing Reed in open country where he could easily be identified. If his hatred was strong enough to override his self-preservation once, it could do so again. Hours passed with no sign of Reed or Matthews. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock. Madeline's eyes burned with fatigue, but she maintained her vigil, moving between windows to watch all approaches to the house. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she heard hoofbeats approaching slowly from the east. Alina, dozing in a chair by the fire, snapped to alertness at Madeline's warning gesture. Peering through the window, Madeline could make out a single rider in the moonlight. The figure was slumped forward, moving at a walk rather than a gallop. Relief surged through her as she recognized Reed's horse and his broad-shouldered silhouette. She hurried to the door, rifle still in hand, and called out, "Reed." "It's me," came his voice, strained but steady. It's safe. Matthews is dead. Madeline ran to him as he dismounted stiffly, catching him as he stumbled slightly. In the lantern light from the open door, she could see blood staining his left sleeve, his face drawn with exhaustion. What happened? Are you all right? I'm fine. The bullet just grazed me. He allowed her to help him into the house, where Alina immediately began gathering medical supplies. We tracked Matthews for hours. He led us on a chase, trying to circle back toward the ranch. Carlos finally spotted him making his way along the ridge above Miller's Creek. Reed winced as Madeline helped him remove his coat and shirt, revealing a bloody furrow along his upper arm. It wasn't deep, but it had bled freely, explaining his weakness. He got the drop on us, Reed continued as Alina cleaned the wound. Had the high ground good cover. Started shooting as soon as he saw us. Hit Carlos's horse, but Carlos managed to jump clear. And then, Madeline prompted, holding Reed's hand tightly as Alina applied a stinging antiseptic to the wound. We returned fire. Matthews was pinned down, but he wouldn't surrender, kept shooting until. Reed's eyes met hers, troubled despite his exhaustion. I shot him, Madeline, had a clear shot when he moved positions, and I took it. There was a question in his eyes, a concern about how she would view him now that he had taken a life. Madeline squeezed his hand firmly. You did what you had to do, she said. He gave you no choice. Relief crossed Reed's face at her understanding. Sheriff Potts and his deputies met us on the way back. They've taken the body to town. He sighed heavily. There'll be an inquest, but it was clearly self-defense. Matthews fired first, and we had witnesses. Alina finished bandaging his arm and brought him a glass of whiskey, which he drank gratefully. The color began to return to his face as the spirit worked through him. It's over, Madeline said, as much to reassure herself as him. He can't threaten us anymore. Reed nodded, drawing her close with his uninjured arm. It's over, he agreed, and we can get back to living our life, building our future. Later, as dawn broke over the Wyoming plains, Madeline and Reed stood together on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The ranch was waking around them, horses nickering in the corral, chickens clucking in the yard, cowboys moving about their morning tasks. I was so afraid, Madeline admitted, leaning against Reed's solid presence, when Tim came with the news that you'd been shot. I know, Reed's arm tightened around her. I felt the same when Matthews threatened you at the schoolhouse, that kind of fear. It shows you what matters most. Madeline looked up at her husband, this man who had taught her that life could begin again after devastating loss, who had shown her that love was not a finite resource but an ever-expanding one. What matters most is this, she said softly. Us, the life we're building together. Reed smiled, touching her cheek gently. Speaking of building, he said, his tone lightening, I've been thinking about adding on to the house. Another bedroom or two. His meaning was clear, and Madeline felt a blush warm her cheeks. That might be wise, she agreed. Especially since we might need one sooner than expected. Reed's eyes widened as her words registered. Madeline, are you? I'm not entirely certain yet, she admitted, but I'm late, and I've been feeling different these past few weeks. Joy blazed across Reed's face, momentarily erasing the lines of exhaustion from the long night. A baby, he breathed, wonder in his voice. Our baby. Our beginning, Madeline corrected, smiling through sudden tears of happiness. Another chapter in our story. As the sun rose fully over Circle K, casting long shadows across the land they had made their own, Reed gathered Madeline close, his kiss a promise of all that was to come. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, strengthened by the love that had brought healing to them both. 5 years later, Madeline sat on the porch of Circle K, watching her children play in the yard. 4-year-old Thomas, named for the man she had loved first, chased his 2-year-old sister Sarah through the flower beds Madeline had painstakingly cultivated. Their laughter rang in the clear Wyoming air, a sound that never failed to fill her heart with gratitude. Circle K had prospered beyond their expectations. Under Reed and Madeline's joint management, the ranch had expanded its operations to include not just cattle, but also horses bred specifically for the U.S. cavalry. Reed's experience as a former soldier had given him insight into what the military required. and their breeding program had quickly earned a reputation for producing mounts of exceptional quality and endurance. Madeline had found her own role, managing the ranch's accounts and correspondence, establishing relationships with buyers across the country. Her education and Eastern connections had proved invaluable in expanding their market beyond the local territory. Rawlins had grown too. From the rough frontier settlement Madeline had first encountered to a proper town with a new school building, a small library, largely due to her fundraising efforts, and even a modest hotel that catered to the increasing number of travelers passing through on their way west. Life wasn't perfect. Wyoming winters were still brutal, the work never ending, and the isolation sometimes difficult, but it was rich with purpose and love. Madeline had long since ceased comparing her life to what might have been had Thomas lived. That path had closed the day she received the telegram, and the one she had taken instead had led to joys she could never have imagined in her darkest days of grief. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up, smiling as Reed rode into the yard. He dismounted with the easy grace that still made her heart skip, even after 5 years of marriage. The children abandoned their game to run to him, Thomas reaching him first with Sarah toddling behind. Reed scooped them both up, one in each arm, their delighted squeals bringing an answering smile to his face. At 33, Reed Kincaid was in his prime, still handsome, with a few threads of silver at his temples that Madeline found inexplicably attractive. "And how are my deputies today?" he asked the children, carrying them toward the porch. "Have you been helping your mama?" "I fed the chickens," Thomas announced proudly, "all by myself. And I helped Alina make biscuits," Sarah added, not to be outdone, "with real flour. Well done, both of you." Reed set them down on the porch steps. "Now, why don't you go see if Alina has any of those biscuits left while I talk to your mama?" The children needed no further encouragement, racing into the house in search of treats. Reed mounted the steps to join Madeline, bending to kiss her briefly but thoroughly. "How was the drive?" she asked when they separated. A portion of their cattle had been sold to a buyer from Cheyenne, with Reed overseeing the first leg of the journey. "Smooth enough. Henderson's men know what they're doing." He settled beside her on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders. "Got a letter from your parents at the post office, and one from Beatrice." Madeline took the letters eagerly. Her parents had finally visited Circle K the previous summer, making the long journey from Philadelphia with some trepidation, but departing with a new appreciation for the life their daughter had built. They corresponded regularly now, with plans for another visit when the new baby arrived in the fall. Beatrice wrote less frequently, her eyesight failing, but her letters were always filled with sharp observations and wry humor. She had become a surrogate grandmother to Thomas and Sarah, sending books and small gifts from Denver for every birthday and Christmas. "There's something else," Reed said, as Madeline tucked the letters away to read later. "Was talking to Sheriff Wilson in town. Seems they're organizing an election for the territorial legislature. Several people suggested I should run." Madeline looked at him in surprise. "You, in politics?" Reed shrugged, a bit self-consciously. "I know it's not something we've discussed. But with statehood likely in the next few years, there's a lot at stake for ranchers and homesteaders. Thought I might have something to contribute." Madeline considered this new development. Reed had always been respected in the community, his fairness and intelligence recognized by everyone from cowboys to businessmen. And he cared deeply about Wyoming's future, often discussing the territory's development and the need for sensible governance as it moved toward statehood. "I think you'd be excellent," she said finally. "You understand this land and its people better than most, and you've always had a gift for seeing all sides of an issue." Relief and pleasure crossed his face. "You wouldn't mind. It would mean more time away from the ranch, more responsibilities." "We'd manage. Carlos can take on more of the day-to-day operations." She smiled, taking his hand. "Besides, I've always thought you'd look distinguished behind a desk making laws." Reed laughed, pulling her closer. "Hardly. Just trying to make sure the folks in Cheyenne don't forget about the working people out here." His expression grew serious. "It would be a partnership, Madeline. I'd need your sharp mind and good sense every step of the way." Then you shall have them, she promised, as always. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. The years stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, children growing, the ranch prospering, perhaps now a role in shaping the future of their adopted home. I never thought I could be this happy again, Madeline said softly, voicing the thought that sometimes still struck her with its truth. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. Reed's arm tightened around her shoulders. I know, I felt the same after Alice. He pressed a kiss to her temple. But that's the miracle, isn't it? The heart's capacity to heal, to love again. He's gone forever, Madeline murmured, remembering those first dark days of grief, the words she had spoken to Beatrice in despair. Reed's voice was gentle as he completed the thought that had become a cornerstone of their life together. Then I'll be here as long as you need. Forever then, Madeline said, turning to meet his kiss as the Wyoming sun gilded the land they had made their own.